Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. It's a great honor. I'm delighted to be able to come and visit Japan. I've never been to Japan or Tokyo before, and as soon as my body is caught up with the jet lag, I intend to explore this wonderful city and country as well. I will try and speak as slowly as I can. I'm afraid my Japanese isn't very good. It's in fact almost non-existent, but I will do my best to help the translators today. I've come here today to talk about a book which I published about 18 months ago, which you can see on the slides there, called Hacking the Bomb. And this was my attempt to wrestle with what I thought, or I believe to be, an absolutely central problem in our world: the intersection of the ultimate weapon, and I don't need to tell people in this room and from this country of the significance of nuclear weapons, with the whole suite of new and emerging technologies under this label of cyber. And this struck me as, one, a fascinating academic project, but also hopefully something that had considerable implications for how we maintain and secure a peaceful and stable world. So what I intend to do with the time allocated to me today is to give you 11 takeaways from the book. I really had hoped this would be 10 because it sounds better, but it is 11. I couldn't squeeze them together. And hopefully this will give you an idea of how I've tried to map out this challenge and thought about it. I should also confess at the start that I'm not a techie. I'm a political scientist, or perhaps more correctly, an international relations scholar. So please forgive me for that to start with. But I also think it's fantastic that in a forum such as this, we can combine people from different backgrounds. And I think many of the issues that we look at today require that cross-discipline and people from different backgrounds to address them. So when I started looking at this cyber nuclear challenge 5 or 6 years ago, and I was very lucky to have some funding from the UK government to do this, a lot of questions seem to abound. So could hackers break into nuclear systems, cause a launch, or prevent these systems from working? Could they be spoofed electronically? Or could operators and decision makers be tricked into making wrong and potentially fatal decisions? Could nuclear secrets be vulnerable to cyber spies and perhaps even would-be proliferators? And in what ways might certain attackers do this? What exactly does the threat look like? And what is vulnerable to in what ways and to whom? How much of the hype should we believe? How worried should we be about this challenge? And of course, finally, what are the best ways to manage and mitigate some of the worst possible scenarios that we could foresee? And interestingly, it seemed to me that some 35 years after this film that you can see on my slide came out in Hollywood, War Games, starring a very young Matthew Broderick, back in 1983, it seemed that perhaps we had reached an era where hackers, perhaps not necessarily a teenager in their bedroom in Seattle, but hackers could get into nuclear weapons, and we had to take this challenge seriously. So it seemed that, as is often the case, what was happening in sci-fi a generation ago had almost become reality today. The first thing that really struck me about, as a political scientist looking at this question, was that the word cyber is fundamentally contested, it is nebulous, it is used by different people, organizations, and countries to mean very, very different things. This often means that analysts or even policymakers talk past each other when we use this word. For some, cyber is actions, and I'm guessing this is a lot of people in this room, purely through the internet or through networks. For others, it's bound up with this concept of information warfare. And for others still, it's something about the whole broader age or period or epoch that we are living in. And this, of course, makes understanding the challenge at its most basic level, let alone responding, really difficult. It also, I think, has and continues to lead to hype and worst-case scenario thinking. A good example of this, and I apologize for picking on Donald Trump, it seems to be a regular theme of people these days, but it's a good example. In 2016, in the presidential election debates with Hillary Clinton, then candidate Donald Trump kept referring to doing the cyber better. We have to do many things better, cyber is one of them. And I think, as I say, Donald Trump is by no means the only person to do this, but gives a good example of how this word is being used in an essentially meaningless way. Whether this refers to cyber attack capabilities, network defense, information security, or something completely different, really isn't very clear, and this comes across a lot in the debate from a political science perspective. So the way that I tried to address this issue was thinking of cyber or computer network operations as two different things. So first of all, comprising a particular set of tools or capabilities or operations, many of which are new, and as well as a broader context within which these operations, capabilities, and tools are being used or are carried out. So the question then becomes not so much which cyber technologies or what cyber technologies can do, but rather how the context alters the way that we understand and interact with the world, and in this case, how we think about and understand nuclear weapons and the politics that surround them. And I think because of this, it often makes sense to work backwards from a problem as a scholar, particularly, as I say, in the social scientists, rather than going in straight away with a framework. And this actually was one of the things, perhaps not the most exciting bit of the research that I did, but was probably the most fundamental to get my head around this definitional and conceptual problem. There is even a case, although I found this increasingly difficult when cyber is in the title of a lot of my presentations, to get rid of the word altogether and go back to some of that language that many in this room will be familiar with from the 1990s. Information security, information warfare, network security, computer security, et cetera, often much more precise in how it's being used. Second key thing to point out from the work, cyber, however we define it, and nuclear are different. It's been quite common, I think, over the past decade or so to compare the two, to try and superimpose lessons or frameworks from the nuclear realm and nuclear era onto cyber. That somehow this is the latest technology that can simply be supplanted and therefore many of the rules will remain the same. But I think this analogy, while the questions that we ask may be correct, the answers are often very different and therefore the analogy is quite often flawed. Again, the major difference here is clearly the amount of damage you can cause. And again, I don't need to tell people in this room how much damage nuclear weapons can do, but modern nuclear weapons, even a small nuclear exchange, would have considerable and significant consequences, probably for everybody on the planet. In reality, where we are now, and there may be others in this room better, in a better position to comment than I, but so far as I'm aware, no one has died of a cyber attack, and the impact would likely to be much more temporary and perhaps, and almost certainly not as devastating. So we're often better thinking, or a good way of thinking about this is a difference between weapons of mass destruction, as in nuclear, and weapons of mass disruption, something that is far more temporary, often much more specialized, secret, and often happening at the lower end of the threat spectrum. Targets are often likely to be different. Sophisticated cyber attacks often have to be very specialized, whereas nuclear weapons are broadly seen as being largely indiscriminate. Transparency is clearly important here. Nuclear weapons are displayed, you can count them, they are quantifiable, you use them for signaling and posturing and a whole host of other things. It's much more difficult in the cyber realm to demonstrate capability or to show off what you have. Moreover, if you do show off what you have, those weapons or capabilities may lose any value that they had to begin with. The other key point with this is that the vast majority of what we think of as cyber threats or cyber operations actually happen right at the bottom end of this spectrum and really have nothing to do with nuclear weapons at all. But there is a tendency, I think, to conflate these two, and that often leads to hype and bad policy. Third point, cyber threats are very diverse. There is no single cyber threat, despite the fact that the way the word is used often seems to imply that that might be the case. And we're far better thinking of a cyber threat spectrum, something that ranges, as you can see on the bottom of the slide there, over quite a wide range of different activities. At the bottom, we have general hacking, nuisance, crime, espionage, denial of service, and then just at the top, and a very small component of this, would be physical attacks, or those attacks or operations seeking to cause damage or destruction. As far as I'm concerned, warfare is quite a problematic concept and term in the cyber realm, and we'll refer back to that later. And I don't think we've had, and I don't think we're likely to have, cyber warfare in the way that we've thought about it in the past. But a lot of these different threats are often lumped together. So when we're talking about a certain type of threat, it can often be misinterpreted or seen through a different lens. And again, this leads to hype, misunderstanding, and perhaps complicates responses, such as in terms of whether deterrence can work in this realm, which we'll come on to a bit later. We can think of attackers in the nuclear realm specifically as trying to do two things, and this goes back to a classic strategic studies way of looking at problems, as looking between intentions and capabilities. So various actors in the nuclear realm may seek to enable something, so that is cause a launch, exacerbate a crisis, cause problems that lead to nuclear use in some way. They may do this indirectly or directly. And I think it's most likely that this is something that a non-state actor would seek to do. I can't see many reasons why a state actor would want to exacerbate a crisis. At least it doesn't immediately come to mind. A state actor is probably much more likely to seek to disable a system, to stop it from working, whether it be an air defense radar, whether it be a particular weapons system, a command and control node, or something else. States, again, I think are more capable of attacking systems directly. They have the time, resources, capability to do this. Whereas non-state actors or cyber terrorists, if there really is such a thing out there, are more likely, I think, to seek indirect measures of doing this, manipulating the information space and finding other ways in. I think one of the reasons for this is quite simply that for a terrorist group, there are often much easier ways of causing damage or achieving their objectives. It's thinking about cyber tools and capabilities as just one part of a toolkit, not necessarily the only one that will always be used. So there's a common perception, I think, across the broader cyber community, both social science and hard sciences, that air gapping or network separation is a way of defending things. If you don't connect systems to the internet, if they are not linked into broader unsecured networks, then they are, if not invulnerable, then certainly safe. But I think this is slightly misguided, and in the nuclear realm, I think is a very good example of how this might work. Another good example, of course, is that Stuxnet, which was discovered in 2010, entered an air gap system in Natanz in Iran. But another good example of the problem of the idea of air gapping or network gapping or separation are the UK Trident submarines. These are the submarines the UK uses to house its nuclear deterrent, the Trident missile inside the Vanguard submarine, which comprises the whole nuclear deterrent for the UK. So when I was doing research for this book, officials in the UK Ministry of Defence and across government constantly told me that this system was absolutely fine. It was invulnerable. Hackers could not break into these submarines. They could not do anything to the UK deterrent because, of course, the submarines are on patrol, somewhere in the North Atlantic, sitting in a deep trench, silent, and no one knows where they are. Well, that's certainly true, but it forgets the fact that somebody has to write the coding for each part of that submarine, all the different systems on it, whether it be for the natural maintenance of the submarine and its lifespan, clean water supplies. Somebody writes coding for the missiles. In this case, that's somebody in the United States, probably at Lockheed Martin, not in the UK. And of course, the warhead also relies on coding as well. These submarines go into base to be patched. The operating system is upgraded. It is often plugged in potentially to unsecure networks, and it gives access to many people while it's in port. They also receive a very small amount of communications via radio waves while they're at sea, and this is potentially another way that you could compromise submarines too. The other aspect of this, of course, is that you don't necessarily, in the UK case, need to cause the warhead aboard to explode to achieve your aims. It may simply be doing something to the submarine that makes it have to come back into port. In the UK case, there are 4 identical submarines. If one fault or problem is caused on that submarine, it will raise questions across the entire force of submarines the UK will deploy. And this would be a massive problem for the United Kingdom, given that it relies on a policy of continuous at-sea deterrence, whereby one of these submarines is always on patrol. Again, it's not the easiest thing to do to hack into these submarines, but I think getting away from this idea that they're invulnerable is really, really important. More broadly, and I've seen this from research that I've done in other parts of the world, including in Asia, there's an increased dependency across all parts of the military establishment on commercial off-the-shelf technology, quite often simply for reasons of economics, and a lot of software that is not built in-house or is further and further away from the actual user. And my research even suggests, and I won't say which country it is, but that at least 2 countries where I've spoken to people rely on software and components not built in that country for their nuclear weapons systems. And I think that's quite an interesting and quite worrying development. So going back to the cyber definitional challenge, if we take it as being a contextual thing and about this latest information age and about the systems upon which we rely, then we also have to accept that some cyber challenges in the nuclear realm and more broadly are inherent. So It's not necessarily that a hacker will break into a particular weapons system, but that those weapon systems and the systems we rely upon more broadly are vulnerable simply because they contain bugs, various software errors, and a whole host of other things. And this means that in the nuclear realm, the more complex things get, the more we rely on complicated code, systems that interact in ways that we sometimes can't foresee, that things could go wrong. This is an idea borrowed from sociology and from Charles Perrow called normal accidents, and we can perhaps expand this to think about normal nuclear accidents theory. That is, that in a cyberized or highly complex, more digitized realm, things just may go wrong without hackers being involved at all. And part of the problem here is that for many countries, there is a tension between keeping nuclear weapons ready to go, the credibility of being able to use them, so that you can deter, you can show your adversary you are willing and able to use nuclear weapons, but at the same time making sure that they are safe, secure, and can never go off by accident. Unfortunately, for many states, it's towards the always side of this dilemma, the always, the being able to use them. And this, I think, exacerbates some of the problems I've discussed. Another way of looking at this, and this came up in the executive meeting yesterday that I attended, is 40 years ago, we have evidence of a number of problems that happened at NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, which monitors potential incoming missile threats to the United States. A whole host of problems with their computers, whereby a training tape was loaded into the system, a circuit chip caught fire, and this caused all sorts of false alarms and problems, the possibility of a massive Soviet incoming attack. Now, these were old computers. They were the big, sort of like cabinet computers. It was the 8-inch floppy disk. It was this era. It was old stuff. And actually, that was a blessing in disguise, because that meant many people could figure out what happened, what had gone wrong, and diagnose the problem quite quickly. The worry today is that we've moved from those big computers where we can see the physical components and what's gone wrong, to something that is far smaller and is often far less easy to diagnose and understand the problems that have occurred. And this, I think the lessons from the 1980s are to be careful how we go about this today. I've put up there Eric Schlosser's book, Command and Control, which is about a nuclear accident in the 1980s. I won't give away the plot, but it is an excellent book if some of you haven't read it so far. The other aspect of this, of course, is the more tightly you keep nuclear systems coupled with warning sensors, so launch on alert, launching soon and quickly to ensure that you're not destroyed in a preemptive attack, exacerbates this problem even more. If you've got systems that may interact in complex ways and that you don't understand, problems and accidents can happen. And in the nuclear realm, of course, the nuclear weapons realm, the implications of this are enormous. Because of this, and I think this is an interesting one for many people in this room who may be involved in developing systems for companies and perhaps even militaries, it's worth thinking about whether modernization and complexity and further digitization of the systems used for nuclear weapons and the sort of broader nuclear enterprise should be modernized and should become more complex, or whether we're better keeping them simple, such as those that were used in the 1980s. The other thing that struck me with the whole cyber challenge is that it's a fundamentally human thing. While we often focus on high technologies, hacking, sophisticated methods of gaining access to information or systems, much of this can actually be traced back to us as humans. Many humans, or humans design and build computer systems. They write the coding, create the software, enter data, operate the machines, and make decisions based on the information that they provide. This is as true for me sitting here with this computer as it is for somebody who works in a nuclear command and control center. Humans unknowingly give away personal information, click on infected emails, download malware, insert infected drives into systems, and are therefore often a key way of bridging the air gap, of getting across sophisticated defenses, and even that separation between systems as well. Humans are clearly a very obvious target for would-be attackers. It's much easier to dupe a human, or perhaps even find a way of social engineering than it is to get past or utilize zero-day exploits or other ways of getting in. This whole idea of cyber social engineering is a really interesting one. I remember giving a similar talk to this several years ago in Canberra in Australia. And as I was doing it, somebody in the audience said they'd looked up nuclear missileers on Facebook and found a group. And it was a group of US Minuteman missileers, the people in charge of the US nuclear weapons in the Midwest, had a Facebook group to tell people what was going on. So I think it's just an example of how information can be shared and information can sometimes very easily be given. This, of course, could be used by a would-be attacker or somebody seeking to compromise those systems. We are, of course, potentially getting into an era where computers might be able to begin to think, and with the integration of artificial intelligence, we might see more and more automation in the nuclear realm. But ultimately, at the moment, computers do what we tell them to do. So it may not be as sexy as Stuxnet or causing a missile to launch or whatever else, but the biggest challenge in the cyber nuclear realm is espionage. Now, this is not new. Anyone that's seen a James Bond film will know that nuclear espionage has been something that in the plot lines of Hollywood for years, and even before 1945 as well. But this challenge is clearly changing in the digital era, in the cyber era, in different ways. So we have to think about the security of both operational secrets, so how things would be done, the policies, the doctrine, the things that you want to keep secret, but also the design of things as well. It may potentially be becoming easier to steal blueprints, various intellectual property of weapons, to share this quicker. No longer do you have to sneak in a camera or take out large amounts of documents or copy by hand. This can now be done in different ways. And indeed, I remember going to the United Kingdom Atomic Weapons Establishment many years ago to give a talk, going in with a USB drive, and they said, there's absolutely no way you can bring that in. You can't do this. Quite simply because it would be so easy, in theory, to download information onto that drive and take it away. The challenge is kind of bifurcated between both hacking into these systems and the information security more broadly. And again, this idea of an air gap or network gap or separation is not a panacea purely because of the human aspect that comes into this. The whole idea of cyber nuclear espionage is not new. You can go back to the 1980s and the cuckoo's egg, where a guy called Clifford Stoll traced an East German hacker through the computers of various laboratories in California and across the United States. But it's expanded pretty exponentially since, even to the point where we're worried, or there is a concern, about sort of digital illicit nuclear trading within this realm as well. Some people may be familiar or be aware of the Pakistani scientist A.Q. Khan, who established a nuclear smuggling network in the 1980s and 1990s. The worry here is that a cyber A.Q. Khan will be far worse and far more worrying. This idea of proliferation is merely only one of the implications of cyber nuclear espionage and the importance of protecting nuclear secrets. It could be a precursor to sabotage. I'll explain about the Syrian nuclear program in a minute. Operation Olympic Games clearly falls under this, the broader program that led to Stuxnet. But again, it can be different. There are different implications for what you might do. But that protection of sensitive information, whether it be operational or design, has become more and more important, I think, in this particular age. So one of the major ideas, or one of the big sort of ideas within this cyber nuclear challenge is, well, we can't deter we can't deter hackers because we don't know who they are, we can't attribute, et cetera. Therefore, ideas of deterrence that we had in the past, whether it be through air power in the 1920s and 30s or nuclear weapons in the 40s and 50s, can't work. Well, I don't think that's quite right. I think deterrence can potentially play a role for this challenge, but with the proviso that an enormous amount of the response will not be deterrence by denial. It will be things happening much more basic. So linked in with the idea that humans are one of the key aspects of this challenge is the fact that many attacks, many security breaches, and many other things probably could have been prevented or at least mitigated through better cyber hygiene, better practice, training, enhanced defense and security, and where necessary, law enforcement as well. So again, it's thinking about where the problem is and the particular aspects to it. However, if we look at this from a strategic perspective, it is at least possible that some cyber operations could be considered as acts of war, maybe not now, but certainly in the future, or military operations, and that deterrence by punishment could have a role to play. But I think the thing to remember here is that cyber deterrence may only apply in certain circumstances, and it's not an either or something that can be graduated. In I think it's 2013, the US Defense Science Board published this very influential report, January 2013, influential report, Resilient Military Systems, and this talked a bit about the nature of the cyber threat and also how it could be deterred, and it quite explicitly linked a nuclear response to a cyber attack. So the idea that not just a conventional but even a nuclear response could be possible or indeed credible in this realm is not far away from the policy debate, and we saw that kind of reflected again, although not explicitly, in the Trump administration's nuclear posture review last year. I think it's worth saying a quick thing about attribution in this room. Again, many people will know more about attribution and probably are involved in it at the moment, but it seems to me, again, this is not a either or, but something that depends on a number of different variables, notably the amount of time you have, the forensic capability you have, and perhaps also the political context within which any attack takes place, although that has to be treated with some caution. Deterrence can become complicated when considering a proportional response in this realm. So it's not necessarily that you would respond in kind. One particular cyber attack being met by another type of cyber attack. We're probably much better off thinking about the impact of these attacks rather than the method through which they were carried out. There's also some some problems here about if you were to try and respond, whether you have to have already breached certain systems and therefore have essentially preempted any attack that you may face. So this broadly sort of comes back to the idea that threatening nuclear retaliation to a cyber attack might seem pretty overblown. It is there in policy documents, but it's something that isn't going to go away. None of the nuclear armed states, certainly the US, Russia, China, or the UK, has explicitly ruled out responding to a major cyber attack, or, as we'll see in a minute, attack involving cyber with nuclear weapons. And ultimately, any country that is attacked in this way, or the attacker, has to run the risk, and those nuclear capabilities may come into play. But the whole point about deterrence here, I think, is that it's not just one type. It's deterrence by denial, those things at the top, and it's possibly deterrence by punishment in certain circumstances. So I think, well, I wouldn't want to be too sanguine about this. Most cyber operations or attacks or hacking is probably, in the nuclear realm, is probably fairly manageable during times of peace, notwithstanding those points I mentioned about weapons that can be used very quickly, but are probably a lot more risky and worrying during any sort of crisis because of time pressures, perceived vulnerabilities, uncertainties, and a whole host of other things as well. And this could happen in a couple of different ways. So state actors, I think, would seek to disable an opponent's key systems before military operations can begin, seeking to prepare the battlefield. This is fairly explicit in both US and Chinese policy for any hostilities in this particular region. This leads to greater uncertainty, pressures for preemptive attack or preemptive strikes, and this fears of use it or lose it. If you don't order firing, you may not be able to because it could be compromised because of uncertainty. There's also the problem that terrorists or other non-state actors or third parties might seek to interfere in various ways, spoofing systems, conducting false flag attacks, flooding the battlefield with misinformation, intending to cause the crisis to escalate. And there are two quite good examples of this. So at the top there, this is a picture of a tweet after the Israeli Defense Forces Twitter account was hacked. And this was back in July 2014. The hackers here simply posted possible nuclear leak in the region after 2 rockets hit Dimona nuclear facility. Now, it was fairly easy for Israeli policymakers and military officials to see that this was a hoax, that they had been hacked, and it could be fairly quickly rectified. But imagine if this had happened in the middle of a crisis, or middle of a beginning of warfare or something else, when time pressures are there, when communications are down, it's more difficult to gain full situational awareness. Something as simple as hacking into Twitter or even stealing a password can be very influential. And the second example, and I mentioned it slightly earlier, is that in 2007, it's believed that Israel managed to hack into Syrian air defense systems to essentially turn off the sensors and fly over and bomb a suspected nuclear facility at Al-Kibar. You could liken this to in Hollywood films where burglars enter a building and find some way of making the cameras go blank so they can walk straight through. It's essentially the same concept. We don't know exactly how the Israelis got into this system, but it's likely that it was hacked in some way before. And it gives you an idea here of how you may compromise early warning, and again, sort of if we expand upon that, how that may work in a crisis. And again, just to reiterate, the reliance of modern militaries on increasingly complex and computerized communications, not least between space and command nodes on the ground, is creating, I think, more problems and more dangers and more potential things to go wrong. It suggests to me, not least in this region, but also in other parts of the world, that what we think we know about nuclear crises and escalation and signaling may need to be reassessed in light of this new context and some of the new problems that we may face. Point 10, viewing cyber in this nuclear world, I think, is quite unhelpful. I don't think we will ever see a pure cyber war, whereas if you'll forgive the terminology, James Lewis says a geek versus geek on a digital battlefield. And I think this temptation to view cyber threats or cyber in isolation or as a separate domain is quite problematic. It may make sense for administrative purposes, but in reality it becomes much more blurred. While clearly cyber operations may be used on their own for low-level gains or low-level policy or even by non-state actors, it seems more likely to me that they'll be used in conjunction with other forms of military force in warfare. Why would you simply use a cyber capability when you could use that alongside your kinetic capabilities? It's thinking about this again as just one tool in a toolbox rather than the only tool just because it's new. But it also means, again, that we need to rethink how the integration between these different forces are. If it is that cyber will be used to go after communication links, early warning, command and control assets, then we need to think about how that is going to impact future warfare as well. At the strategic nuclear level, I think we need to think more broadly as well, and perhaps see this cyber challenge as one component of a new suite of advanced non-nuclear or strategic weaponry. A new suite of capabilities that are different, I think, from traditional military force, tanks, aircraft, and getting closer and closer to nuclear weapons, both in terms of capability, destruction, but particularly in terms of the roles they can carry out. And what we've essentially seen is a percolation of the technologies of the revolution in military affairs from the 1990s have now come up to this strategic nuclear level. So we see and again, something that shouldn't be lost on people in this country, increasingly capable and increasing reliance on ballistic missile defenses as a means of protection, various precision strike weapons, whether they be anti-space, under the sea, or against targets on land, a greater incorporation of artificial intelligence, which is helping with sensing, monitoring and targeting, and a whole host of other things, and other exotic capabilities that we can think of. So if we put cyber into this broader group, we can begin to see a whole suite of technologies that challenge the way that we think about nuclear weapons. Again, it's not thinking of cyber as one thing alone, but as part perhaps of a broader suite of things that are changing the way we do warfare, and in this case, nuclear strategy as well. Final point. What I think we are beginning to see, and I think is increasingly worrying, and this is perhaps only over the last decade, is an emerging norm of using cyber computer network operations to target nuclear and missile forces. This is primarily happening, this is something primarily being done by the United States, but I think will also begin to spread to others as well. So the obvious example of this is Stuxnet back in 2010, but it also seems fairly likely that, I think it was about 2 years ago, an example of this, that the United States is also, perhaps with allies alongside, is also utilizing this approach against other targets too, namely North Korea. A couple of years ago, there were lots of reports of a failed North Korean missile test. And this very quickly, I think it was in the New York Times, was very quickly linked to, well, hang on, has it been hacked? Is this a deliberate sabotage by the United States and its allies? The truth is, we don't know. Missiles go wrong. They are complicated to build. You have to test them. But it plants the idea that this may be happening, and it's almost certainly something I believe that certain states are trying to do. This is actually starting to come out in US policy documents, and this was General James Cartwright, former US government official, said this, I think this was 5 or 6 years ago. And what we're beginning to see is cyber attack capabilities becoming part of both a full spectrum missile defense mission and also the global strike mission as well. The global strike mission was the ability to hit anywhere in the world inside an hour with conventionally armed missiles. Well, this is now not just inside an hour, but also inside 300 milliseconds, that cyber is part of it. But it's also part of the idea of left of launch. So kinetic missile defenses, such as that are deployed in this country and in this region, would be right of launch, that you're utilized after a missile has been fired or after a threat materializes. Left of launch is the idea that you stop that threat materializing before through new ways such as cyber. So this is becoming gradually more explicit in US policy documents, that there is a move towards preemptive use of cyber and other capabilities against nuclear and missile systems. Why is this a problem? Because it creates a precedent. There's a real considerable worry in both Russia and China about what this might mean in terms of their own forces. It's much harder to see these capabilities, of course. They aren't tangible in the way that a kinetic missile defense system is. And this creates uncertainty. It also creates a norm and the possibility that other states will follow suit, something that I believe would make us all rather less secure rather than more. And there's an idea going around that all of these technologies, but particularly the idea of using cyber preemptively against an adversary's systems, is moving us away from mutually assured destruction to mutually unassured destruction. May not be there yet, but we're certainly maybe going towards it. So, conclusion and recommendations. I think the place to start here is with the quote on the right-hand side, and this is from eminent scientist Carl Sagan. And I think this really captures probably where we are today, perhaps not so much in this room, but certainly within society. And he said, it's suicidal to create a society dependent on science and technology in which hardly anybody knows anything about the science and technology. And I think that's increasingly true. A generation ago, people could understand most of the things they engage with, whether it's your car or whether it's various other aspects of your life. Today, as sociologists or even Marxists would say, we're getting further and further away from technology and understanding it, and that relationship is very important, not least, I would argue, in this nuclear realm. Go back to that analogy of NORAD in the 1980s and the big computers and the 8-inch floppy disks, and where we are today with much more networked, complex systems. But a few ideas of where we go in the future. So probably the most important thing from a political scientist's perspective is some sort of agreement on the language that we use, the semantics of cyber and the nature of the threat, of being clear what we mean when we're talking about these issues. We also need to be clear again, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted to many in this room, that a considerable amount of cyber threats or cyber challenges could be ameliorated through better cyber hygiene and good practice. This would probably prevent many things happening in the first place and maybe dissuade attackers from even getting involved. But this has to recognize the central role played by humans. I believe there's a strong need for different communities to speak to each other on this issue, which is why one of the reasons I'm delighted to be here today to speak to people from a slightly different background to my own. These problems that we're facing, whether it be in, cyber threats to particular companies or looking at it in a more conceptual lens or through a more conceptual lens like I am, requires people with different viewpoints, different skill sets, and different understandings of the problem. That's the only way that we get around this. And I think it may mean we need different views, different people, and different groups of people to address this. I think it's probably a good idea to train and deploy specialists, computer security specialists, cyber specialists at nuclear facilities and conduct regular outside red teaming. I think that's something that's actually probably going on here in terms of red teaming. This is something the military does a bit. I don't know how much it happens in the nuclear realm, but it strikes me as being a very obvious and good thing to do. There's ideas about establishing early warning centers and links between countries so we can share threat data, particularly if we believe that the greatest threat is non-state actors and the exacerbation of a crisis or causing a launch. Well, let's share data, let's share insights, let's share best practice between ourselves. The idea that we could establish certain norms or moratoria. I said in the previous slide, we have the establishment of this idea of hacking the bomb, of using cyber capabilities preemptively. Well, if we all believe this is a bad thing, then we should get together and make sure it doesn't happen. Can we find something to agree on that would benefit all of us, that would make us all more safe? And it may be that in this, there is a role for non-nuclear states and allies as well, such as Japan, in pushing this agenda and in trying to frame it and in making the nuclear-armed states look at this in a different way. And finally, I think we need to think about whether these emerging technologies and cyber, including as part of this, need to be looked at in a different way. This may mean including it in current international agreements and international frameworks, but perhaps more likely it means building new frameworks. Much in the way that scientists and scholars in the 1940s and 50s thought about the nuclear revolution and how we manage nuclear weapons, perhaps we need this again, to bring together an epistemic community of some social scientists, but computer scientists and everybody else, to think about what the rules of the road and what arms control and other measures might look like in this new world. And finally, and this is a bit of a soundbite, unfortunately, but I think it does capture things quite well, In this new world, in this new environment, as we go further into a more complex cyber-nuclear future, we should really think about keeping nuclear weapons as simple as possible, not making them complex for the sake of it, keeping them separate from other systems, other military capabilities, including perhaps warning systems as well, and as secure as possible, of not being tempted towards wanting to push towards the being able to use at the expense of security and safety. That's me done. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you.